Mark, the mold in the basement is making me cough. I don't think I can spend another night down there, I said, leaning against the cold kitchen counter. My daughter-in-law Sarah didn't even look up from her laptop. She just sighed, that loud, annoyed sound she always made when I dared to speak. Martha, we've been over this. The guest room is for the kids' playroom now. You're lucky we even found space for you. If you don't like the basement, you're free to find somewhere else. But we both know you can't afford a hotel, she snapped. Her voice was like ice, cutting through the little bit of dignity I had left. My son Mark stood by the window, staring out at the backyard, pretending he couldn't hear a thing. He used to be the boy who would cry if I so much as scraped my knee, but now he couldn't even look me in the eye. I stood there, 72 years old, feeling like a ghost in a house where I did all the cooking, all the cleaning, and all the laundry. They treated me like a servant they didn't have to pay, and every time I tried to mention my health, they made me feel like I was a burden for breathing their air. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like a stranger in your own family? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I truly read every comment. People think that when you get old, you lose your mind or your memory. But what you really lose is your voice. People stop listening because they think you have nothing left to say. My name is Martha Vance, and for the last 2 years, I've lived in a damp, windowless basement while my son and his wife lived the high life on the floors above me. They thought they were the ones in control. They thought I was just a broke old woman with nowhere else to go. But what they didn't know was that every single brick of this house, every luxury car in the driveway, and even the very air they breathed was only there because of me. The morning I moved in, I remember feeling so much hope. My husband, Arthur, had been gone for 5 years, and the big house we shared felt too empty, too quiet. When Mark suggested I sell my place and move in with them to help with my grandkids, I thought it was a blessing. "We want you close, Mom," he had told me. "The kids need their grandma, and we want to take care of you." I believed him because that's what mothers do. We want to believe our children are good people. So, I followed his advice. I put my house on the market, or so I told him, and moved my life into a few cardboard boxes. But the moment the boxes were unpacked, the tone changed. It started with small things. Sarah would mention how expensive groceries were, hinting that I was eating too much. Then she told me that having me on the main floor was disruptive to the children's routine. Within a month, my bed was moved to the basement, next to the water heater and the spiders. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were just stressed. But stress doesn't make you cruel. It only reveals the cruelty that's already there. My daily routine was the same every day. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, before the sun was even up, to start the coffee and prep breakfast for the kids. Sarah expected a hot meal on the table by 7, but I wasn't allowed to eat with them. "It's better if the kids have their own space with their parents," she'd say, ushering me back toward the basement stairs with a plate of dry toast. I spent my afternoons scrubbing floors on my hands and knees, my 72-year-old joints screaming in pain, while Sarah sat in the living room taking work calls or browsing expensive vacation sites. She'd point out a spot I missed with her toe, never once saying thank you. Mark stayed late at the office most nights, and when he was home, he was like a shadow. He didn't defend me. He didn't check on me. He just watched his wife treat his mother like a stray dog she was forced to feed. The worst part wasn't the work or the basement. It was the way they talked about me when they thought I wasn't listening. One night, I was coming up the stairs to get a glass of water when I heard them in the kitchen. "How much longer do we have to keep her here?" Sarah whispered. "The house is a mess, and she's getting slower. The basement smells like old people now, Mark." My heart stopped. I stood in the shadows, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. "She's my mother, Sarah," Mark replied. But there was no conviction in his voice. He sounded tired, bored. "She's a live-in maid we can't fire," Sarah hissed. "If we sell this place and move to the Heights like we planned, we aren't taking her with us. There's a nice state facility 40 minutes away. It's cheap, and she'll be with people her own age. It's time we get our lives back." I didn't get my water that night. I crept back down to my cold, damp bed and stared at the dark ceiling. They were planning to sell the house. They were planning to throw me away like a piece of broken furniture. I felt a sob rising in my throat, but I forced it down. I had spent 2 years being the victim, being the quiet, helpful grandmother who didn't want to cause trouble. But Sarah and Mark had forgotten one very important thing about me. They were so focused on my age and my tired hands that they forgot who I was before I became Grandma. They forgot that Arthur and I didn't just build a life. We built an empire. And while they were busy picking out paint colors for a new mansion they couldn't afford, I was sitting in the dark, realizing that the game was finally over. The next morning, Sarah was especially nasty. She dropped a pile of laundry at the top of the basement stairs and shouted for me to get started. "And don't use too much detergent this time, Martha. We aren't made of money." I looked at the pile of clothes, then at the moldy walls of my room, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was a cold, sharp clarity. I walked to my small dresser and pulled out a hidden folder I kept under my old sweaters. Inside were documents they had never seen, names of companies they wouldn't recognize, and a direct line to a man named Robert, who had been my husband's most trusted lawyer for 40 years. I picked up my phone, my hands steady for the first time in months. "Robert," I said when he answered. "It's Martha Vance. It's time. I want to see everything they've been doing, and I want to see the real estate listing for this house." There was a pause on the other end, then Robert's voice, deep and professional. "I've been waiting for this call, Martha. Are you sure? Once we start this, there's no going back. Mark is your only son." I looked up the stairs, hearing Sarah's shrill voice complaining about the kids' school lunches. "He stopped being my son the moment he let his wife put me in a basement," I said. "Check the trust. Check the deeds. I want to know exactly how much of their world I actually own." As I hung up, I realized that for 2 years, I had been the invisible woman in this house. I was the one who cleaned the messes, the one who cooked the meals, the one they stepped over like a rug. They thought I was the one who needed them. They thought I was at their mercy. But the truth was about to hit them like a freight train. Sarah and Mark were about to find out that when you treat the landlord like a servant, you shouldn't be surprised when you end up on the street. The following afternoon, I was in the middle of scrubbing the kitchen floor when the front door chimes rang. Sarah came flying down the hallway, dressed in a sharp blazer and heels, looking like she was ready for a photo shoot. She stepped right over my bucket, nearly splashing gray water onto her expensive rug. "Martha, move that bucket into the laundry room immediately. The realtor is going to be here any second, and I don't want the house smelling like bleach and old rags," she barked. I didn't say a word. I just slowly stood up, my knees cracking like dry wood, and moved my cleaning supplies out of sight. A few minutes later, a young man in a tight suit walked in, carrying a leather portfolio. His name was Greg, and the way Sarah greeted him, you'd think he was a long-lost king. They started walking through the house, and I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to wipe down the counters, but I heard every single word. "Now, Greg, we're looking to list this place for at least $1.2 million, Sarah said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We've done a lot of work to it, and we need the capital to move into the estates over on the north side. We need more room for the children." Greg nodded, taking notes, but then he looked toward the kitchen and saw me. "Is your mother staying with you?" he asked politely. Sarah didn't even blink. She gave a small, condescending laugh. "Oh, Martha? She's our live-in help. She's been with us for a while, but she's retiring soon. She won't be an issue for the showings." My hand gripped the counter so hard the edge dug into my palm. The help. 2 years of raising her children, cooking her meals, and scrubbing her toilets, and that's all I was to her. I wasn't the woman who gave birth to the man she married. I wasn't the grandmother of her children. I was just help that was about to be discarded. Mark came home an hour later, and Sarah cornered him in the living room. I watched from the shadows of the hallway. She handed him a glossy brochure. "I found the place, Mark. Sunset Acres. It's only 40 minutes away, and they have a vacancy starting next month. If we list the house this weekend, we can have her moved in by the 1st. Mark looked at the brochure, then looked toward the basement stairs. For a split second, I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe. Or a memory of the mother who used to tuck him in at night. But then Sarah put her hand on his arm. "Think about the new house, Mark. Think about the office you'll have. We can finally breathe." Mark sighed, that same weak, defeated sound I had grown to hate. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll talk to her tonight." But he didn't talk to me that night. He waited until Sarah went upstairs to take a bath, and then he crept into the kitchen where I was eating a bowl of cold soup. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. "Mom," he started, his voice shaking. "We're thinking about making some changes. The house is getting to be too much to manage, and Sarah and I think you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age. Somewhere with professional care." I set my spoon down. "Professional care, Mark? Is that what you call a state-funded warehouse for the elderly?" He finally looked up, and his eyes were red. "It's not like that. It's just, we need to move on. We need a fresh start." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that this house was a fresh start I had gifted them. But I kept my voice calm. "And what about the money from my house, Mark? The house you told me to sell so I could move in here?" He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "Well, you know, things have been tight. We used a lot of that for the kids' private school and Sarah's business ventures. There isn't much left, Mom. That's why Sunset Acres is the best option. It's covered by your Social Security." He was lying. I knew he was lying because I knew exactly where that money went. It went into Sarah's closet full of designer bags and the leased SUV parked in the driveway. They had bled me dry, or so they thought. After he left the room, I went down to the basement and called Robert again. "Did you find it?" I asked. Robert's voice was grim. "I found it, Martha. And it's worse than we thought. They didn't just spend your cash. They've been taking out equity lines against the house. They're nearly $300,000 in debt. And they've been using a forged power of attorney to access some of your smaller accounts." I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Forgery. My own son had signed my name to steal from me. "But there's one thing they missed, isn't there, Robert?" I asked, looking at a dusty photo of me and Arthur on my nightstand. "Yes," Robert replied. "They think they own this house because they pay the property taxes. But they forgot about the Vance family trust. This property was never titled in Mark's name. It's owned by a shell company, which is owned by the trust. And you, Martha, are the sole trustee. Technically, they aren't even your tenants. They're guests. And guests can be asked to leave." I leaned back against the lumpy mattress Sarah had given me. For 2 years, I had lived in fear of them. I had lived in fear of the day they'd realize I was no longer useful. But as I listened to the pipes groaning in the walls of the basement, I realized that I wasn't the one who should be afraid. They were planning a grand life in a new mansion, built on the bones of my sacrifice. They were ready to throw me into a cold, sterile room at Sunset Acres and forget I ever existed. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the world my husband and I built. Never underestimate the woman who knows where all the bodies are buried. "Robert," I said, my voice as cold as the moldy air around me, "don't stop them. Let them list the house. Let them find a buyer. Let them get all the way to the closing table. I want them to feel the keys in their hands before I take the entire world away from them." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of my son and his wife laughing upstairs, clinking wine glasses, celebrating the sale of a house that wasn't theirs. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. But the basement wasn't my prison anymore. It was my bunker, and the war was just beginning. The open house was scheduled for Saturday, and Sarah spent the entire week acting like a woman possessed. She was obsessed with making the house look perfect for the wealthy buyers she expected to come crawling through the front door. She bought expensive candles, rented high-end furniture to replace our old comfortable chairs, and spent hours lecturing me about staying out of sight. "Martha, when people are here, I need you to stay in the basement. Better yet, go for a long walk. I don't want potential buyers seeing, well, you know. We want them to imagine a young, vibrant family living here, not someone's aging mother in the shadows," she said while she rearranged the flowers in the foyer. She didn't even look at me when she said it, as if she were talking to a wall. I just nodded, clutching my sweater tighter around my chest. My grandson, Leo, was watching us from the stairs. He's only 8, and he has Arthur's eyes, kind and curious. Later that day, he snuck down to the basement with a half-eaten apple and sat on the edge of my lumpy bed. "Grandma, why does Mommy say you're going to a special hotel soon?" he asked, his voice small and worried. I felt a sharp pang in my heart. They were already telling the children. They were painting a picture of a happy hotel life for me so the kids wouldn't feel guilty when I disappeared from their lives. I pulled Leo close and kissed the top of his head. "Don't you worry, sweetheart. Grandma is just figuring some things out. I'm not going anywhere without saying goodbye," I promised him. But as he left, I saw Sarah standing at the top of the stairs, glaring down at us. "Stop filling his head with nonsense, Martha," she hissed once Leo was out of earshot. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You should be grateful we're finding you a place at all." That was her favorite word, grateful. I was supposed to be grateful for the moldy walls, grateful for the dry toast, and grateful for the betrayal of my own son. On Friday, things took a turn for the worse. Sarah decided that the basement needed to be decluttered just in case a buyer wanted to see the foundation. She didn't ask me. She just marched down with 2 large black trash bags and started grabbing things off my small nightstand. She picked up the old wooden clock Arthur had carved for our 10th anniversary. "This is junk," she muttered, tossing it into the bag. I lunged forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sarah, stop! That was Arthur's. Please, put it back," I begged, my voice cracking. She didn't even pause. She grabbed Arthur's old leather work jacket next, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. "It's old, it's dusty, and it's taking up space. You won't have room for this at the facility anyway," she said, swinging the bag over her shoulder. I looked at Mark, who was standing in the doorway, watching his wife throw away the last pieces of his father's life. "Mark, tell her. Tell her she can't do this," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Mark looked at the bag, then at Sarah, then at the floor. Mom, it's just stuff. Sarah's right. We need to clear the space. We'll buy you new things later, he said, his voice flat and dead. That was the moment I stopped seeing him as my son. He wasn't the boy I raised. He was just a stranger with a familiar face, a man who had sold his soul for a quiet life with a woman who hated his own mother. I sat on the bed and watched them carry the bags out to the curb. I watched as the garbage truck came an hour later and took the wooden clock and the leather jacket away forever. I didn't cry then. I didn't scream. I just waited. I waited for Saturday morning when the realtors arrived. I watched from the basement window as black SUVs and shiny sedans pulled into the driveway. People walked through the house, admiring the crown molding Arthur had installed with his own hands, praising the granite countertops I had paid for with my inheritance. I heard them laughing upstairs, talking about potential and investment. Sarah was in her element, playing the perfect hostess, serving expensive wine she had bought with my Social Security check. By Sunday evening, the house was sold. A wealthy couple from the city had made a cash offer, way over the asking price, with a closing date set for just 2 weeks away. Sarah and Mark were ecstatic. They ordered expensive takeout and opened a bottle of champagne in the kitchen, right above my head. I could hear them clinking glasses and planning their new life in the Heights. To fresh starts, Sarah toasted. And to finally having our own space, Mark added. I sat in the dark basement, the folder from Robert resting on my lap. I had the phone in my hand, but I didn't call him yet. I wanted them to have these 2 weeks. I wanted them to sign the papers at the new house. I wanted them to put down a non-refundable deposit on their new mansion. I wanted them to feel like they had won everything, because the higher you climb, the harder the fall is when the ground disappears beneath you. I spent those 2 weeks acting like a ghost. I didn't complain about the food. I didn't ask about Arthur's things. I even let Sarah take me to Sunset Acres to tour the facility. It was exactly what I expected. A sad, gray building with flickering lights and the smell of industrial cleaner. Sarah talked to the administrator like I wasn't even there. "She'll need a room near the nurse's station," she said, pointing at me like I was a piece of luggage. I just smiled and nodded. The administrator looked at me with pity, but I didn't need her pity. I had something much better. I had the truth. On the morning of the closing, Sarah was humming a tune as she packed the last of the kitchen boxes. "Today's the big day, Martha. Mark will take you over to the facility right after the meeting." "We've already dropped off your boxes," she said, tossing a dish towel onto the counter. "I'm ready, Sarah," I said quietly. "More ready than you know." Mark walked into the room, looking nervous. He had been quiet for days, barely able to look at me. "The meeting is at 10 at the lawyer's office downtown," he said. He thought we were going to his lawyer, the one Sarah had picked. He didn't know that Robert had already spent the last 14 days quietly making phone calls, filing injunctions, and preparing a surprise that would make the front page of the local paper. As we got into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. It was a beautiful house, full of memories that Sarah and Mark had tried to erase. They thought they were selling a building. They didn't realize they were standing on a landmine, and I was the one holding the remote. "Let's go, Mark," I said, sitting in the back seat like the help they thought I was. We wouldn't want to be late for the closing. Mark started the engine, and as we pulled out of the driveway, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 2 years, I had been the invisible landlord, the silent observer of my own destruction. But today, the lights were coming on, and everyone was about to see exactly who owned the ground they were standing on. The drive to the lawyer's office was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, probably picking out more expensive curtains for the mansion she thought she was moving into. Mark gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white, his eyes fixed on the road as if he were driving through a blizzard instead of a clear spring morning. I sat in the back, silent and small, watching the city blur past the window. "Remember, Martha," Sarah said without looking back, "just sign what a lawyer tells you. We don't need any of your stories or questions today. We're on a tight schedule." I didn't answer. I just watched the reflected sunlight dance on the glass towers as we pulled into the parking lot of the firm they had chosen. We walked into the lobby, and the air conditioning felt like a slap in the face. Sarah led the way, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor, while Mark followed behind her like a loyal dog. We were ushered into a large conference room with a mahogany table that was polished so brightly I could see the shame on my son's face reflected in it. A man named Mr. Henderson, Sarah's hand-picked attorney, was already waiting with stacks of papers. "Good morning, everyone. Are we ready to finalize the sale of the property?" he asked, flashing a practiced, professional smile. Sarah sat down and pulled the documents toward her. "Beyond ready. Let's get these signed. Our movers are already at the house," she said. Mark picked up a pen, his hand trembling just a little. He looked at me for the first time that morning. "Mom, it's for the best." "You'll see," he whispered. I looked at the pen in his hand, then at the door. "Actually," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "I think we should wait for my counsel." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Your what?" "Martha, don't start this now. You don't have a lawyer. You don't even have a bank account that I don't see." Before she could finish her sentence, the double doors at the end of the room opened. Robert Hale walked in, looking every bit the powerhouse attorney he was. He wasn't alone. He had 2 assistants carrying heavy briefcases, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Mr. Henderson stood up, looking confused. "Robert, what are you doing here? This is a private closing." Robert didn't even look at him. He pulled out a chair for me and sat down right next to me. "I'm here representing Martha Vance, the sole trustee of the Vance Family Trust," Robert said, his voice echoing through the silent room. Sarah let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "The what?" "Mark, what is he talking about? This is our house. We've lived there for 10 years. We pay the taxes." Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a single, ancient-looking document. "Actually, Sarah, you pay the taxes because the trust allows you to live there in exchange for maintenance. But if you look at the original deed from 30 years ago, the property was never transferred to Mark. It was held in a shell corporation owned entirely by Arthur and Martha Vance. When Arthur passed, Martha became the sole owner of that corporation." Sarah's face turned a strange, sickly shade of gray. She looked at Mark, who was staring at the paper in Robert's hand as if it were a ghost. "Mark, is this true? Tell me he's lying." Mark didn't say a word. He couldn't. He was realizing in real time that the foundation of his entire life was built on sand. Robert leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Furthermore," he continued, "I've been made aware that a sale was attempted without the trustee's consent. That is fraud. And I have also been made aware of a forged power of attorney used to access Martha's personal savings accounts. That is a felony." The room was so quiet you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah's bravado disappeared, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal look. We were just trying to manage things. She's old. She doesn't understand money," she shrieked. "I understand enough to know that you stole my husband's jacket and threw it in the trash," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "I understand that you put me in a basement with mold while I cooked your meals and raised your children. And I understand that you think I'm a burden you can just toss away." Sarah turned to Mark, shaking his arm. Do something! Tell them they can't do this!
We already put a $200,000 non-refundable deposit on the new house in the Heights. If this sale doesn't go through, we lose everything. Mark finally looked up, but he didn't look at his wife. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my son. Not the man Sarah had made him, but the boy who used to hide behind my skirts. "Mom," he choked out, "please." "Don't mom me, Mark," I said, and the words felt like iron. "You stood by and watched her treat me like a dog. You let her throw away your father's things. You let her plan a life where I was locked away in a gray room so you wouldn't have to look at the guilt of what you've become." Robert stood up and handed a new set of papers to Mr. Henderson. "The sale of the house is canceled. The buyers have already been notified that the title is clouded and the seller had no authority to move forward. They are, understandably, withdrawing their offer. As for the deposit on your new mansion, that is your problem. But we have a more pressing matter." Sarah was hyperventilating now, her hands clawing at the mahogany table. "What matter? What else could you possibly do to us?" Robert looked at me, waiting for my signal. I took a deep breath. "As the sole trustee of the Vance Family Trust," I said, "I am revoking your guest status at the property. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. My grandson Leo will stay with me until you find a suitable, safe place for him, one that doesn't involve a basement." Sarah screamed then, a loud, piercing sound of pure rage and panic. She lunged across the table toward me, but Robert's assistant stepped in her way. Mark just sat there, his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. He had lost the house, he had lost the new mansion, and he had lost the mother he took for granted. But I wasn't finished. "The money you stole from my accounts," I added, "will be repaid in full, or I will press charges. Every cent, Mark. Every designer bag, Sarah. Every dinner you bought with my husband's hard-earned savings. I want it back." They thought I was a ghost. They thought I was a servant. They thought they were the ones in power because they were young and loud and cruel. But as I walked out of that conference room with Robert by my side, I didn't feel like a 72-year-old woman with a bad hip. I felt like the woman who built a world, and that world was no longer open to people who didn't know the value of love. "Where to now, Martha?" Robert asked as we reached the car. I looked at the sunny street, feeling the warmth on my face for the first time in 2 years. "To the house, Robert. I have some things to move out of the basement. And then, I think I'd like to see about turning that guest room back into a bedroom. A real one." As we drove away, I didn't look back at the office building. I knew Mark and Sarah were still in there, surrounded by the ruins of their greed. They had tried to sell my life to buy a lie, but in the end, the only thing that was sold was their own future. And for the first time since Arthur died, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one holding the light. The silence in the car on the way back from the lawyer's office was even heavier than before. But this time, the weight wasn't on my shoulders. I could feel the heat of Sarah's rage radiating from the passenger seat, a silent, vibrating anger that made the very air feel thin. Mark was still white-knuckled, his chest heaving with shallow breaths, as if he were trying to process the fact that his entire world had just collapsed in a single hour. When we pulled into the driveway of the house, my house, the sight of it felt different. For 2 years, this place had been my cage, a grand structure of brick and mortar where I was tucked away in the dark like a shameful secret. Now, the sun hit the windows and reflected a truth that had been hidden for too long. This wasn't a vibrant young family's home. It was the Vance estate, built by a man who spent 40 years in the sun and a woman who spent 40 years by his side. As we stepped out of the car, Sarah finally snapped. She didn't wait to get inside. She turned on me right there on the pavement, her face twisted in a way that made her look like a complete stranger. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just kick us out and everything will be fine? We have kids, Martha. Your own grandchildren. Where are they supposed to go? You're a monster. A cold, bitter old monster," she screamed, her voice echoing off the neighbors' houses. I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the smallness of her spirit. "The same place you were going to send me, Sarah," I said quietly. "Difference is, you have your youth, your health, and the money you thought you were going to steal." "Oh, wait, that's right. You spent that on handbags and car leases, didn't you?" Mark stepped between us, his hands shaking. "Mom, please, let's just go inside. We can talk about this. We can find a compromise." I walked past him toward the front door, pulling my own set of keys, the ones I hadn't been allowed to use in months, from my purse. "The time for talking ended when you signed my name to those bank documents, Mark. You have 48 hours. I've already arranged for a security team to be here on Monday morning to change the locks. If you aren't out by then, your belongings will be placed on the curb." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of chaos and clarity. I spent most of the time in the living room, sitting in Arthur's old armchair, which I had moved back from the garage. I watched as Sarah frantically packed boxes, throwing things with a violence that showed she still didn't understand the gravity of her situation. She spent half her time on the phone, screaming at the developers of the new mansion, begging for her deposit back, only to be told time and again that the contract was ironclad. They had lost $200,000 of stolen equity, and they had nowhere to go. Mark was a different story. He moved through the house like a ghost, packing his things in a daze. He tried to talk to me several times, coming into the room with that sad puppy dog look he'd used since he was 5 years old. "Mom, I didn't know about the forgery. Sarah told me you signed those papers. I swear," he pleaded. I looked at him and felt a deep, hollow sadness. "Even if that's true, Mark, you knew I was in the basement. You knew I was breathing mold while you were eating steak upstairs. You knew your father's clock was in the trash and you didn't stop the truck. Ignorance isn't an excuse for cruelty." On the second night, the house was a mess of half-packed boxes and open suitcases. Sarah had stopped screaming and had moved into a state of icy, calculated silence. She tried one last tactic. She brought Leo and the other children into the living room and made them sit at my feet. "Tell Grandma how much you're going to miss her," she prompted, her eyes boring into mine. "Tell her how sad you are that we have to move into a tiny apartment because she's taking our home." Leo looked up at me, his eyes wide and confused. He didn't understand trusts or deeds or forgery. He only knew that his world was changing. I reached out and took his small hand in mine. "Leo, sweetheart, I want you to listen to me. Grandma loves you very much, and you will always have a place here. But your mommy and daddy need to learn how to be adults. They need to learn that you can't build a happy life by hurting the people who love you." Sarah lunged forward and grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him away so hard he stumbled. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare try to turn my children against me." I stood up, my hip aching, but my spirit stronger than it had been in a decade. "I don't have to turn them against you, Sarah. You're doing a fine job of that all on your own. Now, I suggest you finish packing. You have 12 hours left." The final morning was the hardest. A moving truck sat in the driveway, a cheap, rented one,
not the professional white-glove service they had planned for their move to the Heights. I stood on the porch as they carried out the last of their things. Mark walked up to me one last time. He looked older, defeated. "We're going to stay at Sarah's sister's place for a while. It's small, but it's something." I nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mark. And I hope one day you realize that your father didn't build this for you to hoard. He built it for us to share. But you chose her greed over our family." Sarah didn't even look at me as she got into the car. She slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. As the car pulled away, Leo waved from the back window, and I waved back until they disappeared around the corner. Then, for the first time in 2 years, the house was silent. I walked back inside and closed the door, leaning my head against the cool wood. I was alone, but for the first time, I wasn't lonely. I walked through the rooms, looking at the empty spaces where their expensive furniture had been. It felt like the house was finally breathing again, shaking off the tension and the lies. I went down to the basement one last time. I looked at the lumpy mattress and the moldy walls, and I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange kind of gratitude. Those 2 years had stripped away everything I thought I knew about my son, but they had also shown me who I was. I wasn't just a grandmother or a widow or help. I was Martha Vance, and I was still here. I spent the rest of the day moving my things back into the master bedroom. I pulled the old lace curtains out of storage and hung them in the window, letting the light filter through. I called Robert and told him to send over the cleaning crew I had hired, the professional one, to scrub every inch of the basement and turn it into a proper storage room. No one was ever going to live down there again. As the sun began to set, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles over the stolen money, and the relationship with Mark might never be fixed. But as I looked at the empty chair across from me, I felt Arthur's presence more strongly than ever. "We did it, Arthur," I whispered. "The house is safe." I realized then that being a mother doesn't mean being a doormat. It means teaching your children right from wrong, even if the lesson comes 40 years too late. And as I watched the first stars appear in the sky, I knew that for the first time in a very long time, the landlord was home, and the doors were finally locked against the cold. The first week of silence in my home was strange. I found myself waking up at 5 in the morning out of habit, my body tensing as I prepared to hear Sarah's sharp voice demanding breakfast or complaining about the temperature of the house. But there was nothing. No footsteps thudding above me, no muffled arguments, no sounds of children playing in the rooms they were never taught to respect. I'd walk into the kitchen and see the empty space where the clutter had been, and for a moment, I'd forget that I was no longer the servant. I spent those first few days simply reclaiming the air. I opened every window, letting the spring breeze blow through the hallways to carry away the scent of Sarah's expensive candles and the stale energy of their greed. I spent hours in the master bedroom, the one with the large bay window that Arthur and I used to sit by every morning. My hip was still sore, a dull ache that reminded me of my mortality, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. Robert called me on Wednesday afternoon with an update that made my blood run cold. "Martha, we finished auditing the smaller accounts Sarah accessed with that forged power of attorney. They didn't just spend the cash for groceries and bills. They were using your identity to open credit lines in your name. We found 4 cards with maxed out balances, totaling over $50,000. I sat down at the kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my palms. $50,000. It wasn't just the money. It was the calculated theft of my future. They had been building a mountain of debt in my name. likely planning to let the accounts default once they had me tucked away in that state facility. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively erasing me while I was still alive. "What about the mansion in the Heights, Robert?" I asked. "The one they put the deposit on?" Robert let out a short, dry laugh. "That's where it gets interesting, Martha. I did some digging into the development company, Summit Living. It turns out they are a subsidiary of the Vance Ellis Holding Group. Do you remember that name?" I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Arthur and I started that group 35 years ago. It's the primary vehicle for the trust." Robert continued. "Exactly. Sarah and Mark had no idea. They walked into a sales office, signed a contract, and handed over a $200,000 deposit to a company that you, technically, oversee through your board of directors. The developer called me this morning. They were notified about the legal injunction we filed regarding the house sale, and they wanted to know if they should proceed with Mark's purchase." I looked out the window at the garden Arthur had planted. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them to wait for your instruction. But Martha, since the funds they used for that deposit were sourced from the equity line they fraudulently took out on your current home, the developer has grounds to seize the deposit as part of a fraud investigation. In short, that money is gone, and they won't be getting the keys to that mansion. Not today, not ever." A few hours later, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera, another new addition Robert had insisted on, and saw Mark standing on the porch. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was unwashed, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. I opened the door just a crack, leaving the security chain on. "Mom, please," he whispered the moment he saw me. "Sarah is losing her mind. We're staying in her sister's guest room, and it's a nightmare. The developer for the new house called. They're saying the contract is void and they're keeping the deposit because of legal irregularities. We don't have that money, Mom. It was everything we had left." I looked at my son, the man I had nurtured and protected, and I saw the consequences of a life lived without a moral compass. "That wasn't your money, Mark. It was equity stolen from this house. It was my security you gambled away." He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, his voice breaking. I know I messed up. But Sarah, she's threatening to leave me. She says if I don't fix this, if I don't get the house back, she's taking the kids and going to her parents in Florida. I can't lose my children, Mom. Please, just sign the release for the house. We'll move back in, and I'll make sure things are different. I'll fire the cleaners. I'll take care of the yard. I'll do whatever you want." I felt a flicker of the old Martha, the one who wanted to open the door and pull him into a hug. But then I remembered the basement. I remembered the mold. I remembered Sarah tossing Arthur's clock into a trash bag while Mark watched in silence. You're not losing your children because of me, Mark. You're losing them because you married a woman who values mansions over people. And you became a man who values peace over his own mother. You can't come back here. This house is no longer a family home. It's a monument to what happens when you take love for granted. He looked up, his eyes full of a desperate, ugly anger. So that's it? You're just going to let us starve? You going to let your grandkids sleep on a floor because of a trust? I didn't flinch. I've already spoken to Leo's school, Mark. I've paid his tuition for the rest of the year directly. And I've set up a fund for the children's needs that you and Sarah can't touch. They will be fine. But as for you, maybe a tiny apartment and a real job will teach you what your father tried to show you all those years ago. You don't get the heights, Mark. You get reality. I closed the door and locked it, listening to him shout my name for a few minutes before he finally gave up. I walked back to the kitchen and sat in the silence, my heart thumping. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But as I sat there, I realized that for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't coughing. The mold was gone, Sarah was gone, and the invisible landlord was finally making her presence felt. But Robert had one more surprise for me that evening. He sent over a digital file with the transcripts of Sarah's emails to the realtor. In one of them, she had written, "Once we get her into the state home, we can finally stop pretending. I want the basement converted into a wine cellar as soon as she's out. Make sure the movers know that anything left in her room goes to the dump. I don't want a single trace of her in my new life." I read those words over and over until they were burned into my mind. They hadn't just wanted me gone. They wanted to erase my very existence. They wanted to turn the place where I had suffered into a room for their wine. I deleted the file, stood up, and went to the basement. I stood in the middle of the small, damp room and looked at the spot where my bed had been. Tomorrow, I was going to have a crew come in and tear down the walls. I was going to turn this dark, hidden space into a bright, open studio with windows that let in the light. No one would ever be invisible in this house again. Sarah and Mark thought they were the ones who knew how to manage property. They thought they were the ones with the power. But they had forgotten that a house is only as strong as its foundation, and they had spent 2 years rotting ours from the inside out. Now the foundation was being rebuilt, and they were the ones left out in the cold, realized that the help they had despised was the only thing keeping the roof over their heads. A week later, I wasn't sitting in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in the lobby of the Summit Living corporate headquarters, the same company that owned the Heights development where Sarah had planned to move. The building was all glass and steel, looking out over the city Arthur and I helped build. I was wearing my best navy blue suit, the one I hadn't worn since Arthur's funeral. I looked at my reflection in the elevator doors, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a tired old woman in a basement. I saw the woman who had run a boardroom while Mark was still in diapers. Greg, the young realtor who had called me the help just a few weeks ago, was there too. He was standing near the receptionist desk, looking sweating and nervous. When he saw me walk in, his eyes went wide. He started to walk toward me, probably to tell me I was in the wrong place, but then the CEO of the company, a man named David who had known Arthur for 30 years, walked out of his office with a wide grin. "Martha, it's been too long," David said, reaching out to take my hand. Greg stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw practically hitting the floor. I just smiled at David and then looked at Greg. "Hello, Greg. I believe you were looking for the owner of the Vance property?" David laughed, clapping a hand on Greg's shoulder. "Greg, I don't think you've been properly introduced. Martha Vance is the majority shareholder of the group that funds this entire project. Technically, she's your boss's boss." I watched the blood drain from Greg's face. He tried to stammer out an apology, something about a misunderstanding, but I just held up my hand. "It's fine, Greg. You saw what Sarah wanted you to see. People usually do." But the real reason I was there wasn't to intimidate a realtor. It was because Robert had told me Sarah was in the building, refusing to leave until she got her $200,000 deposit back. David led me to a private conference room that overlooked the main floor. I could see Sarah through the glass. She was at a desk in the sales department, shouting at a poor girl who looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Mark was sitting beside her, his head in his hands, looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "She's been here for 3 hours, Martha," David whispered. "She's threatening to sue. She claims she was the one who authorized the deposit and that it's her personal money." I looked at the documents David handed me. It was clear as day. The money had come from the fraudulent equity line on my house. "Let them in, David," I said. "I'll handle this." A moment later, the door opened and Sarah marched in, her face red and blotchy. She didn't even see me at first. She was too busy barking at David.
"I don't care about your legal delays. That money is mine and I need it now. We've already moved our things into a storage unit that's costing us a fortune and—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me sitting at the head of the table. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark followed her in, and when he saw me, he just stopped and leaned against the wall. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I stood up slowly, leaning on my cane. "I'm here to finish what you started, Mark." Sarah's eyes darted from me to David, then to the stack of papers on the table. "What is this? Why is she here?" she demanded. David crossed his arms. "Martha is here because she is the one who has to decide whether or not to press charges for the fraud you committed to get this deposit. Since the funds were stolen from her trust, the money technically belongs to the Vance holding group now." Sarah let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "Stolen? We're family." "It wasn't stealing. We were going to pay it back once we sold the house." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold sense of justice. "You were never going to pay it back, Sarah. You were going to put me in a facility and forget about me while you lived in a mansion built on my husband's hard work." Sarah lunged toward the table, her fingernails digging into the wood. "I want my money, Martha. You can't do this. We have nothing. Mark lost his job because he was too distracted by all this legal nonsense, and we're broke." I looked at Mark. "Is that true?" He nodded slowly. "They fired me yesterday, Mom. Lack of focus," they said. I felt a brief sting of sorrow for my son, but then I remembered the basement. I remembered the cold soup. I remembered the way he stayed silent while Sarah called me the help. I turned back to David. "The $200,000 will remain with the trust. It will be used to repair the damage they did to my home and to settle the fraudulent credit lines they opened in my name." Sarah screamed then, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed being crushed. She started throwing her purse against the wall, shouting about how unfair it was, how she had worked so hard to build their image. Mark didn't even try to stop her. He just looked at me. "What are we supposed to do, Mom? We have the kids." I took a deep breath. "I've already told you, Mark. The kids will never go without. I've set up a trust for their housing and their education. But you and Sarah? You're going to have to do what I did 50 years ago. You're going to have to work. You're going to have to find a small apartment you can actually afford. And you're going to have to learn that you are not entitled to a life you didn't earn." Sarah was sobbing now, but they weren't the tears of a broken woman. They were the tears of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. She grabbed her bag and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking a desperate, angry rhythm on the floor. Mark stayed for a moment longer. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He finally just nodded and walked out after her. As I watched them go, David sighed and sat down. "You're a strong woman, Martha. Most people would have folded." I looked at the empty chair where my son had just been sitting. "I didn't fold for 2 years, David. I just waited for the right time to show them that being old doesn't mean being weak." But as I left the building, I knew the victory was bittersweet. I had my house back. I had my money back. I had my name back. Nayapatriala Sina. And as I drove back to the house that Arthur and I built, I realized that the invisible landlord
didn't need a mansion in the Heights. I had everything I needed right where I was.
But there was one more thing I had to do, one final piece of the puzzle that would ensure Sarah could never hurt this family again. The renovation of the basement took exactly 10 days. I hired a crew of young men who reminded me of Arthur, hardworking, polite, and quick to smile. They tore out the moldy drywall, replaced the old pipes, and installed large, bright windows that let the afternoon sun flood into what used to be my prison. I watched them work from the kitchen, sitting in my favorite chair, sipping tea that was finally hot and fresh. It was strange how such a small change could make the house feel so different. The heavy, dark energy that Sarah and Mark had brought with them was being hauled away in dumpsters, one load at a time. I spent my afternoon sitting in the garden, watching the flowers bloom, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to exist. Robert came over on Friday with a final stack of documents for me to sign. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. "It's done, Martha," he said, sliding a pen across the table. "The equity line has been closed, the credit cards have been canceled, and the holding group has officially reclaimed the deposit from the Heights development. Your finances are secure." I signed the papers with a steady hand. "And Sarah?" I asked. Robert's expression turned serious. "She's being investigated for the forgery. The bank isn't letting this go easily, especially since the amounts were so high. Mark is cooperating with them, trying to save himself, but it's messy. He's living in a studio apartment now, working as a junior clerk for an old friend of David's. It's a huge step down from his old life, but it's a living." I felt a twinge of sadness for Mark, but it was distant, like a memory of a movie I had seen a long time ago. He had made his choice, and now he was living with it. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. I checked the camera and saw Mark standing there, but he wasn't alone. He had Leo with him. I opened the door and let them in. Leo ran to me immediately, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Grandma, Daddy said we could come visit," he cried. I hugged him tight, smelling the scent of grass and sunshine on his hair. "Of course you can, sweetheart. You can always come visit." Mark stood in the foyer, looking around at the freshly painted walls and the bright open spaces. He looked tired, really tired. "Sarah's gone, Mom," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "She went back to Florida yesterday. She said she couldn't live like this, in a shoebox apartment. She's filing for divorce." I looked at my son and saw a man who had finally hit rock bottom. "I'm sorry, Mark. For the kids' sake, I'm sorry." He walked into the kitchen and sat at the table where we used to have Sunday dinners. "I lost everything, didn't I? The house, the job, the wife, the money. All because I was too weak to stand up to her." I sat down across from him. "No, Mark, you lost those things because you forgot who you were. You forgot that you were a Vance. You forgot that being a man means protecting the people who love you, not just the people who want something from you." He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't look like a stranger. He looked like my son again. "I want to make it right, Mom. I don't know how, but I want to try." I reached across the table and touched his hand. Making it right starts with being a father to Leo and the others. It starts with earning a living instead of stealing one. I've already told Robert to set up a visitation schedule. You can bring the kids here every weekend. They deserve to know this house is their home too. Mark started to cry then. Real, honest tears of shame and relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." I didn't say anything. I just let him sit there and feel the weight of his own choices. I wasn't going to give him money, and I wasn't going to let him move back in. He needed to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. But I wasn't going to turn him away either. That's the thing about being a mother. You never stop loving them. But sometimes you have to love them from a distance while they grow up. After they left, I walked down to the newly finished basement. It was beautiful now, bright, clean, and full of life. I had turned it into a library and art studio for the grandkids. There were shelves full of books, easels for painting, and a large, comfortable rug where they could sit and play. I stood in the center of the room and realized that this was the final victory. I hadn't just reclaimed my house. I had reclaimed my family's future. Sarah thought she could erase me, and Mark thought he could ignore me. But in the end, I was the one who decided the ending of this story. I was the invisible landlord no longer. I was the heart of this house, and the foundation was finally strong again. As I turned off the lights and walked back upstairs, I felt Arthur's presence one last time. I could almost hear him laughing, telling me he knew I had it in me all along. I climbed into my own bed, in my own room, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The war was over, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. The house was finally quiet, and for once, the silence was a beautiful thing. It's been a year since that day at the closing table, the day I stopped being a victim and started being Martha Vance again. Sometimes I sit on my porch in the evenings, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes, and I think about how close I came to disappearing. If I hadn't made that phone call to Robert, if I had stayed quiet and grateful like Sarah wanted, I'd be sitting in a gray room at Sunset Acres right now, staring at a television I wasn't allowed to control. Instead, my house is full of light and the smell of home-cooked meals. The basement is no longer a dark secret. It's a place where my grandkids spend their weekends painting messy pictures and reading stories until they fall asleep on the rug. Sarah didn't fare well in Florida. Robert told me she tried to sue her own parents for her inheritance early, but they saw right through her and cut her off completely. She's currently serving 3 years of probation for the forgery, and she has a permanent mark on her record that ensures she'll never work in a high-end office again. She calls Mark sometimes, demanding money he doesn't have, but he's finally learned how to hang up the phone. Mark is still working at that clerk job. He's thinner now, and he looks older, but there's a quiet strength in him that I haven't seen since he was a teenager. He takes the bus to see me every Saturday morning, and we spend the day working in the garden together. He doesn't ask for money, and I don't offer it. We talk about Arthur. We talk about the kids. And sometimes, we just sit in the silence. He's earning his way back into this family, one honest day at a time. I realize that the greatest mistake I ever made as a mother wasn't being too strict or too loud. It was being too quiet. I thought my silence was a gift of peace, but it was actually a permission slip for them to be cruel. If my story has taught you anything, I hope it's this. Never let anyone make you feel small just because you've lived a long life. Your age isn't a burden. It's a badge of survival. You aren't a piece of furniture in your children's lives, and you don't owe anyone your dignity in exchange for a place to stay. Real love doesn't put you in a basement. Real love doesn't hide you away. And real love certainly doesn't steal your husband's memories to pay for a designer lifestyle. I still read every single comment you leave on these videos, and I want to hear from you one last time today. Have you ever had to make a hard choice to protect yourself from your own family? Does justice always feel this bittersweet? Also, please don't forget to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your support has been the light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel for me. Loneliness doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of the best chapter you've ever written. My name is Martha Vance,
and I'm the landlord of my own life. Thank you for listening, and remember, don't let anyone ever make you invisible. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more stories about standing up for what's right, and I'll see you in the next one.